Managing the threshold of violence. The strategies groups use to manage the threshold of violence can potentially provide them with greater operational and tactical leeway. The preceding two sections identified a number of strategies that groups can employ, including provoking an indiscriminate counter-response by a government and using narratives to encourage a host population to adopt a higher tolerance for violence. Before elaborating on these general strategies that may apply across insurgent groups, it may be useful to explore some of the specific tactics groups have used to manage the upper threshold of violence. For decades, the IRA waged a violent campaign to detach Northern Ireland from the United Kingdom to form a united republic incorporating all of Ireland. The IRA employed a variety of techniques against British and Loyalist forces, including bombings and assassinations, as well as kneecappings. Darby noted that the group monitored the Catholic community's reaction to its use of violence and that it was keenly aware of the community's tolerance for violence. Quote, "A review of IRA statements clearly demonstrates its awareness of the need to monitor the response of the Catholic community to its actions. Most attacks, such as bombings of economic targets, were announced without comment or justification. Whenever additional care is taken to justify or explain a particular incident, as when the families of serving soldiers were targeted, it was almost always to a background of real or anticipated internal opposition. On the evidence of the IRA's use of legitimate targeting, its denials of unwanted casualties, its exclusion of certain groups from attack, and its care to anticipate internal criticism, it is clear that the IRA is aware of the limits of its own community's tolerance." End quote. How did the group attempt to manage and influence the upper threshold of violence? The previous quote gives several clues. One of the main ways was through legitimate targeting, or declaring certain groups, institutions, or interests in Northern Ireland legitimate targets for attack. Such declarations were often published in Anfoblek, the weekly publication of Sinn Féin, the political arm of the IRA. Darby noted that between 1970 and 1989, there were 218 references to legitimate targets in Anfoblek, with most directed at economic targets, 37.6%, state institutions, 14.2%, criminals, 13.8%, and informers, 7.8%. Interestingly, members of the Army and police accounted for just 7.3% of cases. By defining what constitutes a legitimate target and publishing this determination in its flagship publication, the group was clearly attempting to raise a population's upper threshold of violence, particularly with respect to target selection rather than level of violence, to a level that would facilitate operations and tactics. Another tactic was to give sufficient warning of a possible attack on a target, particularly if the target was fungible in the sense of representing civilian infrastructure that can have a military use in certain contexts. For instance, Darby noted that in 1972, the IRA took particular care to justify potential attacks on an Army post in the Royal Victoria Hospital, RVH, as suggested by the following warning issued in Anfoblek. Quote, "On several occasions since the resumption of offensive operations by the IRA, several streets in the Lower Falls area have come under heavy attack from British Army snipers operating from the roof of the School of Dentistry in the RVH. Until now, we have been loath to take retaliatory action because of the proximity of the hospital. If this sniping continues, however, action will have to be taken in the interests of the local people." End quote. Darby noted that this threat was widely criticized by the media, which was dismissed by Anfoblek as, quote, "much wild publicity," end quote, with the newspaper publishing a photo purporting to show the Army operating from the hospital. Interestingly, this example illustrates that asymmetric and private information may complicate efforts to manage the threshold. That is, if a group obtains information through intelligence collection, for example, indicating that a civilian target is being used for military purposes, and if such information is not widely known throughout a population, the group may need to take extra actions to justify its target selection, while at the same time protecting its sources and methods. Other tactics used by the IRA to influence a population's tolerance for violence included taking actions in addition to legitimate targeting to lend an air of legitimacy to its use of violence. For instance, violent resistance movements often want to be seen as maintaining a monopoly on the use of legitimate violence, and so they may question the legitimacy of rival groups' use of violence, as occurred when the IRA dismissed rival Republican activists as gangsters, criminals, and enemies of the people. The implied message sent to the population was that the IRA's use of violence was legitimate, whereas that of other groups was illegitimate. Another tactic is to give the impression that some type of legal and due process was followed before the threatened or actual use of violence. For instance, the IRA issued the following statement in 1975 regarding the threat to use violence against an informer. Quote, "In the light of this and other unpublished information obtained from him, it was decided that he could not be allowed to remain in the community. Only two ways were open to ensure his removal. One, that he be shot and thus permanently separated from the community, or two, that he be exiled from Ireland, so that he could no longer be responsible for the deaths, shootings, and imprisonment of other Irish people. After due consideration of his age, disposition, and the state of truce, we decided on the latter penalty, exile. He was given 48 hours to leave the country, after which he will be immediately shot on sight." End quote. Lastly, another tactic the IRA used to legitimate its use of violence was to direct attacks at criminals and other antisocial elements, thereby signaling that its use of violence played an important role in the provision of a critical, non-excludable public good, that is, security. For instance, the IRA used or threatened to use violence against burglars, car thieves, sex criminals, drug dealers, peddlers in stolen goods, and even young joyriders who stole cars and caused disruption in many areas. As another example, the JVP waged a similar campaign in Sri Lanka in the 1980s, taking actions against drug dealers and illegal liquor vendors, and the group also attempted to crack down on prostitution. Now that we have seen how the IRA managed the threshold of violence, what are some of the more generalized strategies that may apply across different resistance movements? As previously mentioned, one potential option available to violent resistance movements is a strategy of provocation, whereby attacks against a government are designed to provoke an indiscriminate counter-response that causes significant damage to non-combatants. Bueno de Mesquita identified various competing effects of a government crackdown on terrorist mobilization, and these effects apply more broadly to the adoption of a provocation strategy by a violent resistance movement. Specifically, a government counter-response decreases the ability of a violent resistance movement to carry out attacks, which makes mobilization less attractive to a population. Conversely, it generates ideological opposition to a government and imposes economic costs on a population, both of which foster mobilization and help overcome the collective action problem. Before initiating action, a violent resistance movement must estimate a subjective, prior probability on the likelihood of each of these effects, so we address each at greater length. At a minimum, before using violence, a resistance movement must estimate a target government's likely response and the ensuing damage it will inflict on the organization. If a movement's leadership attaches a high subjective probability to a state of the world that does not materialize, that is, a moderate or otherwise manageable government response or outright capitulation to the group, then its existence may be at stake, as was the case when the JVP misjudged the response of the Sri Lankan armed forces when it issued the death threat to the family members of serving personnel. Kalivas noted that Argentine leftists committed a similar miscalculation by planning a campaign of violence to provoke the government to respond indiscriminately in the hope that the response would generate a level of dissatisfaction sufficient to launch a revolutionary process. As Kalivas noted, Argentine leftists were correct in their judgment regarding the likelihood of an indiscriminate response, but incorrect in judging their ability to manage it, as they were eliminated in the process. Hence, incorrect judgments regarding existential factors can be fatal, and a host population may have no choice but to side with the indiscriminate actor if the organization that waged the provocation strategy is eliminated in the process. The second potential outcome of a crackdown is heightened ideological opposition to the government, which increases radicalization and boosts mobilization in support of the resistance movement. This is the main intent of a provocation strategy, and as noted in the previous section, this response is associated with the intense feelings of anger and unjust victimization that can follow a disproportionate government response. Luke Condra, along with his co-authors on a working paper for the National Bureau of Economic Research titled The Effect of Civilian Casualties in Afghanistan and Iraq, decomposed this potential response into a number of different potential effects and suggested that civilian casualties caused by an incumbent government consist of short-run information and capacity effects, and also longer-run propaganda and revenge effects. The authors define a revenge effect as the desire to enact retribution after harm has been committed against an individual or against his or her family, friends, or neighbors. A propaganda effect exploits feelings of humiliation and anger and mobilizes people against an incumbent government or foreign force in the absence of direct harm against themselves, family, or close associates. Civilian casualties may also discourage a host population from sharing information regarding the identity and location of insurgents with an incumbent government or foreign force, out of either anger or fear for their own physical security. The authors label this as an information effect. Lastly, an increase in civilian casualties, if they are also accompanied by successful attacks on a resistance movement, may degrade the ability of the resistance to carry out successful attacks against a target government, as previously noted. The authors define this as a capacity effect. Analyzing data collected by the Civilian Casualty Tracking Cell maintained by the International Security Assistance Force in Afghanistan, the authors found evidence to support the revenge effect, as they estimated that civilian casualties from a typical incident generated by counterinsurgents were responsible for an additional incidence of violence in an average-sized district over the following 6 weeks. Interestingly, the authors found no evidence that out-of-area casualties led to an increase in violence against the International Security Assistance Force, nor did they find evidence in support of the information and capacity effects. Although these results cannot be generalized outside of their specific context, they seem to indicate that increases in a population's threshold of violence may be primarily limited to those individuals directly affected by a government's counter-response. This suggests that leaders of resistance movements may be able to elevate the upper threshold of violence if they are correct in a belief that a government counter-response will directly affect a large portion of a populace. The third potential outcome of a provocation strategy is increased mobilization against the government brought about by the reduction of opportunity costs caused by an indiscriminate response. What this means is that a population may have incentives to join a resistance movement if an indiscriminate campaign causes widespread damage that eliminates income-earning opportunities within the economy. By making it less likely that potential recruits will be foregoing profitable employment opportunities by joining a resistance movement, the former may be more likely to take up arms, especially if doing so offers opportunities to enhance their security or material prospects. Various authors have provided empirical details of the economic cost of resistance activities on societies where resistance movements are located, and on the potential impact on the concomitant reduction in opportunity costs. Examining data from the Palestinian Labor Force Survey, as well as data on the number of suicide attacks during the Second Intifada, Ephraim Ben-Melech, Claude Berebi, and Esteban Clore, in their article on The Economic Cost of Harboring Terrorism, found that a successful attack was followed by an immediate 5.3% increase in the unemployment rate for the district of origin of the suicide bomber, relative to the average Palestinian district-level unemployment rate, and led to a 20% increased likelihood that average wages in the district of origin would fall in the following quarter. Additionally, the authors found that a successful attack reduced the number of Palestinians working in Israel by 6.7%, relative to the average percentage of Palestinians working in Israel for all districts. Additionally, Alberto Abadi and Javier Gadiazabal, in an American Economic Review case study on the costs of conflict, estimated that a 10% gap in per capita gross domestic product in the Basque Country emerged over a 2-decade period as a result of violence the Basque separatist group Euskadi Ta Askatasuna, ETA, utilized against the Spanish state. There is also empirical evidence indicating that poor economic conditions enable resistance organizations to recruit better educated and better qualified personnel. In an article on economic conditions and the quality of suicide terrorism, Ben-Malek, Berebi, and Clore found that a 1 standard deviation increase in the unemployment rate in the West Bank and Gaza Strip led to a 34% increase in the probability that a suicide bomber had some academic education and a similar increase in the probability that a suicide bomber was previously involved in violent activities. Therefore, we see that empirical evidence supports the proposition that a government crackdown may promote mobilization in support of a violent resistance movement, at least among those directly impacted by violence, which may lead to a host population's higher tolerance for violence. Can one therefore claim that a resistance movement can generally employ a strategy of provocation to boost its popularity and raise the upper threshold of violence? Before answering this question, we note that an incumbent government commonly wages a policy of repression and collective punishment. In an analysis of 30 insurgencies that began and were resolved between 1978 and 2008, depicted in Victory Has 1,000 Fathers, Sources of Success in Counterinsurgency, Christopher Paul, Colin Clark, and Beth Grill noted that counterinsurgent forces used a policy of repression and collective punishment in 20 of the 30 cases. However, repression and collective punishment have a long history. Kalivas noted that in March 1944, German forces in occupied Greece issued a public announcement indicating that sabotage would be punished with the hanging of 3 residents of the closest village unless the perpetrators were caught within 48 hours, or it was shown that the villagers had actively discouraged sabotage operations. The announcement concluded by noting, quote, "Hence the duty of self-preservation of every Greek when learning about sabotage intentions is to warn immediately the closest military authority," end quote. From an incumbent government's perspective, the logic behind a policy of repression and collective punishment is nicely captured by statements Napoleon Bonaparte made to one of his commanders, quote, "Burn some farms and some big villages in the Morbihan and begin to make some examples. It is only by making war terrible that the inhabitants themselves will rally against the brigands and will finally feel that their apathy is extremely costly to them," end quote. The underlying assumption of such a strategy, as Kalivas noted, is that targeted non-combatants are somehow associated with insurgents and will therefore force them to cease their attacks against the government, or effective bonds with non-combatants may cause insurgents to cease their attacks to spare non-combatants from further damage at the hands of counterinsurgents. One mistake that counterinsurgents may make, though, as noted by Kalivas, is to overestimate the effective bonds between insurgents and non-combatants or the influence of the latter on the former, as suggested by the following example. Quote, "However, insurgents may also disregard civilian demands, most likely when they come from villages with weak ties to them. The villagers of Malandreni, in the Argolid region of Greece, were told in April 1944 that a German officer would visit them on a set date. Upon learning of the visit, the communist-led partisans decided to set up an ambush. Fearing German reprisals, the villagers demanded that the local Communist Party branch intervene with the partisans and have them cancel the ambush. The village party secretary describes the reaction of his regional boss. "Who do you think you are, comrade?" he was told. "A representative of the Germans?" To which he replied, "No, comrade. I just came to compare the benefit of ambushing the Germans with its cost. This is why I came." "The Germans burned many other villages," the boss replied, "but these villages joined the partisans." End quote. Rousing non-combatants from their apathy also appeared to be the Israeli strategy during Operation Cast Lead against Hamas in late 2008 and early 2009. As noted in one New York Times article written during the conflict, quote, The Israeli theory of what it tried to do here is summed up in a Hebrew phrase heard across Israel and throughout the military in the past weeks: Bal Habayit Hishtageya, or the boss has lost it. It evokes the image of a madman who cannot be controlled. This phrase means that if our civilians are attacked by you, we are not going to respond in proportion but will use all means we have to cause you such damage that you will think twice in the future, said Giora Island, a former national security advisor. End quote. The article went on to note that Israeli actions led to Palestinians' deep rage toward Israel, but there were also some indications that residents of Gaza attempted to rein in Hamas. These two competing effects of Israel's policy of collective punishment suggest that Israeli decision-makers, who are likely well-versed in the conflict with the Palestinians and its nuances given the conflict's lengthy history, formulated subjective probabilities favoring the conclusion that the benefits accruing from Palestinian non-combatants reining in Hamas would exceed any negative effects that would follow from increased support and mobilization favoring Hamas. Now we return to our earlier question of whether a provocation strategy is likely to be successful for a violent resistance movement. In the 30 insurgencies examined by Paul, Clark, and Grill, 22 were won by insurgents, while the remaining 8 were won by counterinsurgents. In 18 of the 22 cases of insurgent victories, counterinsurgents attempted a strategy of repression and collective punishment, while in the 8 cases of counterinsurgent victories, repression and collective punishment were used in only 2 cases. Interestingly, in 14 of the 18 cases in which repression and collective punishment were used unsuccessfully, such tactics allowed counterinsurgents to win intermediate phases of the conflict on the way to defeat. These results suggest that there is strong evidence to conclude that counterinsurgents should not employ a policy of collective punishment and repression. The authors noted, quote, "Repression can win phases by dealing insurgents a blow and making support for them more costly, but our data show that the vast majority of phases that were won with repression ultimately increased popular support for the insurgency and ended in a counterinsurgency defeat for the entire case." End quote. Hence, there appears to be strong evidence supporting the notion that insurgents can use a provocation strategy to build support and potentially increase a population's tolerance for increasing levels of violence. Kalivas also noted a number of cases in which an indiscriminate response backfired on the counterinsurgents. Regarding the use of indiscriminate violence by Germany during World War II, he noted, quote, "The most infamous example of the futility of indiscriminate violence is possibly the Nazi reprisal policy in occupied Europe, aimed at deterring resistance against occupation. Reprisals appear to have been an utter and complete failure. They simply did not stifle resistance activity, and more importantly, they appear to have actually induced people to join the resistance. Whatever the purpose of the German policy of reprisals, Condit points out, it did little to pacify Greece, fight communism, or control the population. In general, the result was just the opposite. Burning villages left many male inhabitants with little place to turn except guerrilla bands. Killing women, children, and old men fed the growing hatred of the Germans and the desire for vengeance. German observers in neighboring Yugoslavia frankly concluded that rather than deterring resistance, reprisal policy was driving hitherto peaceful and politically indifferent Serbs into the arms of the partisans. Nazi reprisals produced a similar effect all over occupied Europe." End quote. In addition to German conduct during World War II, Kalivas also cited a number of other interesting examples. Quote, "Writing about the Vendee War in 1797, Gracchus Babeuf observed that the violent measures of the Republicans against the Vendean insurgents were used without discrimination and produced an effect that was completely opposite to what was expected. A Greek guerrilla leader in Ottoman Macedonia at the start of the 20th century asserted that a judicious balance had to be used in the administration of violence, for indiscriminate killing does harm rather than good and makes more enemies. Another one remarked that the art is to find who should be punished. Henriksen affirms that in revolutionary warfare, reprisals serve the rebels' cause. He notes that in colonial Mozambique, again and again, Frelimo converts pointed to Portuguese acts as the prime factor for their decision. Non-Portuguese observers substantiated this assertion." End quote. Hence, there appears to be strong empirical evidence suggesting that a resistance movement can use violence to promote mobilization and potentially raise the upper threshold of violence if it succeeds in goading an opposing force into using a level of indiscriminate violence that inflames a population but which does not incapacitate a resistance. These findings suggest that violence, when used by counterinsurgents, may only be effective when selective, that is, when used solely against insurgents and those individuals who actually provide material support, such as supplies, information, and sanctuary to a resistance movement. However, various authors raised several qualifications to these observations. Reed Wood, in an article on rebel capability and strategic violence against civilians in the Journal of Peace Research, noted that the argument that a population traumatized by an indiscriminate counterinsurgency campaign would flock to the insurgents rests on the overemphasized assumption that the insurgents have the capacity to protect civilians and safeguard their livelihood, which may not be the case. He stated, quote, "While regime backlash may mobilize civilians who were already at or close to the point of indifference between remaining neutral and supporting the rebels, it does not necessarily follow that most civilians would support insurgents in the wake of indiscriminate regime violence. Without credible security guarantees from the rebels, civilians likely have insufficient incentive for supporting the risk of insurgents. Indeed, civilians may blame the rebels for the escalation in violence and withhold support. Even when government forces kill large numbers of civilians, destroy property, and use other forms of collective punishment, civilians choose to collaborate with the incumbents' forces if the rebels are seen as weak." End quote. As an example, Wood cited the case of the Tigray People's Liberation Front, TPLF, an Ethiopian group that fought against the ruling military committee known as the Derg, which came to power after the overthrow of the Haile Selassie regime in 1974. Wood noted, quote, "The TPLF's experience in Afar is telling. The Derg's campaign of repression against the Afar generated significant grievances among the population, but was insufficient to drive the people into the arms of the rebels. In order for the rebels to profit from Mengitsu's violence, they had to credibly demonstrate their commitment to making positive contributions to the lives of the Afar. This meant providing benefits such as economic development, political and educational structures, security, and justice systems." End quote. Frustration with the inability of insurgents to provide public goods, including security, was also evident in Darfur, as indicated by the comments a sheikh in the town of Lobato in Darfur made about the Sudan Liberation Army, SLA, quote, "We are angry at the SLA because they cause us this bad situation. All of our wealth and our homes are taken, but they run away and don't defend us." End quote. Another example is the remarks denouncing Hamas from the Palestinian woman whose house was destroyed by Israel. Kalivas also cited a number of other historical examples, arguing that a counterinsurgent force need not invest the resources to carry out a more selective and costly campaign of violence and can instead rely on a more cost-effective strategy of indiscriminate violence when insurgents are weak. Quote, "This analysis yields the following prediction. Incumbents can afford to be indifferent about the type of violence they use when insurgents are unable to offer any protection to civilians. Put otherwise, costly discrimination can be dispensed with when insurgents are weak. When this is the case, indiscriminate violence does succeed in paralyzing an unprotected population. When American indiscriminate violence made the Filipino civilians thoroughly sick of the war, they were forced to commit themselves to one side. Soon, garrison commanders received civilian delegations who disclosed the location of guerrilla hideouts or denounced members of the infrastructure. Likewise, most Missourians turned to the Union in their despair, Fellman notes, not out of a change of faith, but as the only possible source of protection. Guatemala provides the paradigmatic case in this respect. After the Guatemalan army used massive indiscriminate violence against the population, Civilians who had initially collaborated with the rebels were left with no choice but to defect because the rebels utterly failed to protect the population from the massacres. As Stoll points out, while the guerrillas could not be defeated militarily, they were unable to protect their supporters. End quote. Hence, these examples suggest that a provocation strategy may not succeed if a violent resistance movement is not capable of providing security against an indiscriminate government response. As suggested in the cited examples, when non-elites carefully weigh the costs and benefits of different actions and potential end states, ideological preferences, for example, communism, a liberated Jerusalem, may give way to more immediate concerns associated with well-being and security, particularly for those who do not form the hardcore element of a movement. In addition to whether an insurgent force is capable of providing security, there are other factors that need to be considered when determining whether a provocation strategy can be used to increase the threshold of violence. First, there may be certain structural conditions that favor an indiscriminate strategy, thereby diminishing the utility of a provocation strategy. For instance, Alexander Downes, in his article Draining the Sea by Filling the Graves, argued that indiscriminate violence may be effective when used against a relatively small population in a confined geographic space because it permits counterinsurgents to imprison or kill the entire population, thereby effectively interdicting the provision of supplies, recruits, and information to insurgents. As an example, Downes cited British tactics during the Second Anglo-Boer War of 1899 through 1902, which consisted of indiscriminate farm burning combined with the confining of the entire Boer civilian population of more than 110,000 into 34 squalid concentration camps. The farm burning destroyed the food supply, while the effort to control the population through internment precluded any possibility that the population could assist the insurgents. The internment led to the death of more than 46,000 Boer and African civilians, many of whom died of preventable diseases caused by malnutrition, overcrowding, and unsanitary conditions. Additionally, a confined geographic space was a factor, as the territory of the two Boer republics was already small before Britain adopted the scorched earth policy. This made it easier for the British to clear the veld of the entire Boer and African population, and the combination of these tactics led to the defeat of the insurgents. Another factor that needs to be considered, as noted earlier, is the degree of ties and affinity between insurgents and host populations. This was discussed previously in the context of collective punishment and from the perspective of insurgents and their interest, or lack thereof, in the welfare of non-combatants. However, it is also relevant from the perspective of non-combatants and their attitudes toward insurgents, because the decisions of the former may materially impact the welfare and prospects of the latter. An interesting example is the reaction of the Shia in southern Lebanon after Israel invaded in 1982 to root out the presence of the Palestine Liberation Organization, PLO. An innocent observer might expect the Shia to side with their Muslim co-religionists in the PLO. However, the Shia population was sick of the depredations of the PLO and blamed the group for Israeli reprisal attacks before the 1982 invasion. In fact, the Shia in southern Lebanon initially welcomed the Israeli invasion, greeting incoming troops with handfuls of thrown rice. Opinion would soon turn against the Israelis when it became apparent they planned a long-term presence in the region. Nonetheless, the larger point is that by the time of the 1982 invasion, ties between the local Shia population and the PLO were strained, which impacted the population's level of tolerance for PLO violence against Israel. This example indicates that it is necessary for leaders of violent resistance movements to have a good read of the distribution of attitudes among a population when considering whether to use violence that may bring reprisals. The fact that Shia attitudes were relevant in the contest between the PLO and Israel in southern Lebanon points to the larger issue of the role of civilian agency, that is, the ability of a civilian populace to affect outcomes in conflicts between an incumbent force, domestic or foreign, and a resistance movement. Indeed, civilian agency is the driving force underpinning the threshold of violence conceptual model, and Luke Kondra and Jacob Shapiro, in their article titled "Who Takes the Blame? The Strategic Effects of Collateral Damage," found empirical evidence that it played a role in combat against insurgent forces in Iraq. Analyzing significant activity reports of coalition forces in Iraq between February 2004 and February 2009, the authors argued that the Iraqi population punished the actor it deemed responsible for collateral damage. Specifically, if coalition forces were blamed for collateral damage, insurgent attacks on coalition forces increased in subsequent periods. The authors attributed this increase to a decrease in the sharing of information about insurgents by non-combatants with coalition forces, which in turn allowed the latter to target insurgents and disrupt operations, thus reducing the ability of insurgents to produce violence. This in turn implies that, in this case, collateral damage caused by coalition forces raised a population's upper threshold of violence, because the withholding of such information led to an increase in insurgent attacks on coalition forces in Iraq. In contrast, collateral damage attributed to insurgents resulted in fewer subsequent attacks, which the authors attributed to greater information sharing between host populations and coalition forces. Another tactic that violent resistance movements can use to affect the upper threshold of violence is the provision of economic aid and social welfare benefits to win hearts and minds. Some groups hope this tactic will translate into greater host population support for their militant activities. This logic is nicely captured by Bloom, who cited the case of Hamas. Quote, Hamas spokespersons acknowledge that the group sees its sizable social programs as a means of building and maintaining popular support for its political goals and program, including its militant and armed activities. The political level is the face of Hamas, but without the other divisions, Hamas would not be as strong as it is now, according to Ismail Abu Shanab. It needs the three parts to survive. If nobody supports these needy families, maybe nobody would think of martyrdom and the resistance of occupation. Another Hamas leader, Ibrahim al-Yazuri, characterized Hamas's objective as the liberation of all Palestine from the tyrannical Israeli occupation, which is the main part of its concern. Social work is carried out in support of this aim. End quote. Hence, for Hamas, the political intent of economic aid is to buttress the will of the people to support violent resistance against Israeli control over the West Bank and Gaza Strip, and indeed against Israel's existence. This strategy parallels Hezbollah's efforts to establish a society of resistance that is ever ready for war with Israel. As part of this effort, Hezbollah provides a number of Iranian-funded social welfare services for fighters and party members and for Lebanese affected by the conflict with Israel. For instance, the Martyrs Foundation, an Iranian organization, made an important contribution to the provision of healthcare services in Lebanon, principally with the construction of the Al-Razul Al-Azam Hospital in Dahiyah, a southern suburb of Beirut. All medical expenses of injured Hezbollah fighters are paid for at this facility, while 70% of expenses are covered for injured civilians. Interestingly, during elections, Hezbollah volunteers transport patients and staff at this facility to and from the polls. The foundation also established, in Beirut and in Lebanon's Bekaa Valley, vocational schools for the daughters of fallen Hezbollah fighters and funds subsidized workshops to employ them. Another important social welfare benefit financed by Iran and provided by Hezbollah to Lebanese affected by combat is the Reconstruction of Homes. In particular, Jihad al-Bina, Holy Reconstruction Organ, a construction company run by Hezbollah, partners with the Martyrs Foundation to rebuild homes destroyed during combat with Israel. Reportedly, 1 month after the 1996 Israeli military campaign Grapes of Wrath, Jihad al-Bina rehabilitated more than 2,800 structures damaged by Israel in 106 locations in South Lebanon, and overall, between 1993 and 2006, the organization is estimated to have rebuilt nearly 15,000 homes. Hezbollah collaborates with the Martyrs Foundation on Reconstruction, with the insurgent group determining the validity of families' housing needs and, if necessary, arranging for the required property transactions. Financing provided by the Martyrs Foundation is used to acquire land, for which Jihad al-Bina subsequently develops plans and builds the finalized structures. Recent press reports indicate that Iran has spent $400 million to rebuild Dahiya after the July 2006 war with Israel. Another notable contribution to social welfare made possible by funding from the Martyrs Foundation is the construction by Jihad al-Bina of 4,000-liter water reservoirs in each district of Beirut's heavily Shia southern suburbs. Each reservoir was filled 5 times a day from continuously circulating tanker trucks, and in the absence of state-provided electricity in this area until 1990, generators mounted on trucks went to different buildings to provide the electricity required to pump water from private cisterns. As of 2006, Jihad al-Bina served as the main source of drinking water for 500,000 people. Jihad al-Bina also provides public refuse collection for the 500,000 residents of Dahiya. In addition to the provision of public goods and social welfare benefits, groups can also potentially employ narratives to raise the upper threshold of violence. Jeffrey Halverson, Lloyd Goodall, and Stephen Corman, in Master Narratives of Islamist Extremism, defined a narrative as a system of stories or a collection of stories that relate to one another through coherent and consistent themes. Additionally, Jerome Bruner noted in his book The Culture of Education that narratives often have universal qualities despite the particular circumstances under which they arose. One of these qualities is the centrality of trouble. Bruner noted that stories worth telling and worth construing are typically born in trouble. Seminal works by a variety of cognition scholars have long argued that people package information gathered from everyday life into narrative form. A narrative structure is thought to be critical for individuals to make sense of information and assign it meaning. When confronted with the complexity of actors, motivations, goals, and underlying cause and effect relationships, narratives are especially important tools for turning disparate facts into comprehensible stories and, as will be argued, potential drivers of violence. Hence, relevant for our purposes is the notion that violent resistance movements can potentially use narratives to encourage people to engage in violent collective action against an incumbent government or to persuade a host population to accept the legitimacy of, or at a minimum passively accept, a resistance movement's use of violence. Increased legitimacy in turn raises or at least maintains a population's tolerance for a group's use of violence. How can violent resistance movements use narratives to potentially affect the threshold of violence? One way to approach this question is to use social movement theory, SMT, to deconstruct insurgent narratives and understand how they promote collective action. Sociologists originally developed SMT to understand the formation and evolution of a variety of movements, such as the civil rights and the pro-life movements in the United States. Although this theory was initially applied to mostly nonviolent social movements, the tools and framework of SMT can also be applied to understanding the narratives of insurgent movements. A fundamental concept within SMT is that of a frame. Irving Goffman, in his book on frame analysis, first defined frames as schemata of interpretation that enable people, quote, to locate, perceive, identify, and label, end quote, events they experience or that are brought to their attention. More simply, a frame represents a worldview or paradigm through which events and concepts are interpreted, and thus it represents a means through which meaning is constructed and reality is interpreted. Within the context of a social movement, by assigning motives and meanings, a frame can help overcome the collective action problem that is inherent in many insurgencies. As such, Robert Benford and David Snow, in their article, Framing Processes and Social Movements, define a collective action frame as, quote, action-oriented sets of beliefs and meanings that inspire and legitimate the activities and campaigns of a social movement organization, end quote. Thus, collective action frames perform an interpretive function by simplifying and condensing the world out there, especially in ways, quote, intended to mobilize potential adherents and constituents, to garner bystander support, and to demobilize antagonists, end quote. Therefore, an important question for our purposes is how a collective action frame can be used to raise the threshold of violence. Benford and Snow noted that collective action frames perform three core framing tasks, specifically diagnostic framing, prognostic framing, and motivational framing. The first identifies the problem and its victim and attributes the problem to responsible actors and causes. The second specifies a proposed solution and a strategy for carrying out corrective action. The third provides a rationale for engaging in remedial collective action, including an appropriate vocabulary of motive. This task is necessary to minimize free riding and encourage collective action. For insurgent groups, many diagnostic frames are essentially injustice frames that identify the population from which the group emerged as a victim of what the group regards as a historical injustice perpetuated by some other actor. For instance, the diagnostic frame of the PLO encompassed a narrative that emphasized the loss of Palestinian land to Jewish settlers, the displacement of much of the original Palestinian population to the West Bank, Gaza Strip, and surrounding Arab countries, and the establishment of a Jewish state on most of British Mandate Palestine. In the case of The Shining Path, the diagnostic frame centered on the arrival of the Spanish and the downfall of the Inca Empire in the 16th century as the cause of the current economic and social misfortune of the indigenous population of Peru. Hence, we can see that sometimes a diagnostic frame entails a historical original sin that, from the perspective of leaders of a violent resistance movement, needs redress, and often a prognostic frame will call for the use of violence to sweep away existing conditions to pave the way for the establishment of new political, social, economic, and diplomatic arrangements. An example is provided in the form of text from Hezbollah's 1985 open letter addressing the group's attitudes and perceptions of Israel. Quote, "We see in Israel the vanguard of the United States in our Islamic world. It is the hated enemy that must be fought until the hated ones get what they deserve. This enemy is the greatest danger to our future generations and to the destiny of our lands, particularly as it glorifies the ideas of settlement and expansion initiated in Palestine and yearning outward to the extension of the Great Israel from the Euphrates to the Nile. Our primary assumption in our fight against Israel states that the Zionist entity is aggressive from its inception and built on lands wrested from their owners, at the expense of the rights of the Muslim people. Therefore, our struggle will end only when this entity is obliterated. We recognize no treaty with it, no ceasefire, and no peace agreements, whether separate or consolidated." End quote. In this passage, Israel figures prominently in Hezbollah's diagnostic frame, as it represents, quote, "the greatest danger to our future generations and to the destiny of our lands, and is aggressive from its inception, and built on lands wrested from their owners at the expense of the rights of the Muslim people." End quote. The prognostic frame, which specifies what needs to be done, is fairly clear in its call for the use of violence. Quote, "Therefore our struggle will end only when this entity is obliterated." End quote. Undoubtedly, the members and leadership of Hezbollah believe passionately in the themes represented within the diagnostic and prognostic frames captured in this section of the letter. However, narratives such as these also serve an instrumental purpose in terms of assisting with recruitment and, more generally, generating greater acceptance within a host population for a group's activities, including violent actions. More specifically, a group's narrative can potentially bolster legitimacy for its activities if it exhibits high fidelity with what are known as master narratives. Halverson, Goodall, and Corman defined a master narrative as a, quote, "transhistorical narrative that is deeply embedded in a particular culture," end quote. Such narratives embody themes that deeply resonate with a population or culture, and Daniel Bernardi et al., in a book on narrative landmines, noted that master narratives frequently appear over time and play a hegemonic role within a culture's narrative landscape. Quote, they, master narratives, exercise mastery over competing narratives in the culture's narrative terrain, not by eliminating, but rather by marginalizing these alternative narratives. This repetition suggests a high frequency of dominant encoding on behalf of authors and decoding on behalf of readers. This frequency serves to cement these narratives as central components of a community's sense of history and perspective on the world. End quote. Bernardi et al. Also noted that narratives provide an explanatory framework and are often derived from foundational religious texts, such as the Quran, Bible, and Torah. They may also draw from historical experience. The authors noted that Islamist extremists tend to draw from master narratives that invoke the Crusades or European imperialism in the Middle East during the modern era. One recent example of this phenomenon is a video released by Al-Qaeda in the Islamic Maghreb, justifying its use of violence by linking it with resistance to the commencement of the French occupation of Algeria in 1803. Quote, the war that is being waged by the jihadist group in the lands of the Islamic Maghreb is a legitimate war that seeks to defend against the diverse crusader attack against Islam and its people in our Maghreb countries. This began with the wicked French occupation of Algeria in 1803 and is still continuing until this very day. End quote. Another master narrative resonant within the Islamic world is that of the Nakba, translated as the catastrophe in Arabic, which is the term used by Arabs to describe the establishment of the State of Israel in May 1948. In an extensive attack on Ayman al-Zawahiri, then second in command of Al-Qaeda, published in the Egyptian daily Al-Masri al-Yum, Sayyid Imam al-Sharif, a former associate of al-Zawahiri who has since renounced violent jihad, criticized Al-Qaeda for using the Palestinian cause as an empty talking point. Quote, it is well known that the fastest way to gain popularity among the Arab and Muslim masses is to bash the United States and Israel and talk a great deal about the Palestinian issue. Nasser did it, Saddam did it, Ahmadinejad does it, as do others. However, these people have actually done something for Palestinians, whereas bin Laden and al-Zawahiri just talk. End quote. While the phrase just talk is used in a pejorative sense in this statement, the use of narratives to enshroud violent actions that are actually taken can potentially infuse actions with legitimacy and raise a population's threshold of violence. Hezbollah's open letter taps into each of the themes captured by the master narratives previously cited. Israel is generally seen within the Islamic world as a neocolonialist implant and usurper of sacred Muslim territory that illegitimately wrested control of the land of Palestine from native Palestinians. Emmanuel Karagianis, in his article on Hezbollah as a social movement organization, noted that Hezbollah has traditionally proffered a Jerusalem liberation frame in its narrative, in which the group frames its military actions against Israel as a religious duty for devout Muslims to liberate Palestine and Jerusalem from infidels. By traditionally adopting such a frame in its narrative, the group has tried to build greater support within the broader Arab and Muslim world for its activities, including the use of violence. Hence, one way in which a group can attempt to influence the threshold of violence is to enshroud its violent activities in narratives that are highly resonant with the master narratives of a host population. A similar strategy is to equate the use of violence today with the heroic and legitimate activities of canonical figures from the past. Such was the rhetorical strategy of the Shia revolutionaries who successfully overthrew the Shah in the late 1970s. The revolutionaries sanctified violence and self-sacrifice in the name of the Islamic Revolution by juxtaposing extant violence with the exemplary martyrdom of canonical Shia imams at the time of the sect's founding. They also referenced other religious figures, thereby implying that current violence would be rewarded with personal and eternal salvation in the afterlife, along with a privileged position next to the pantheon of martyred Shia imams. For instance, in one Friday prayer sermon delivered in March 1980, Hojat al-Islam Sayyid al-Khamenei, the current supreme leader of Iran, stated that, quote, "The martyrs are addressing us, saying, 'You must continue our way,' and that they want us to guard the heritage of their blood, that is, the Islamic Republic and the victory of the Islamic Revolution. Additionally, the martyrs are encouraging us to hold the Quran in one hand and a gun in the other to wage war against all plots and cowardliness." End quote. Additionally, in a sermon delivered in October 1979, Ayatollah Hussein Ali Montazeri, commemorating Iranians killed in combat against Kurds in the Kurdish region of Iran, noted that the former were martyrs who drank the elixir of martyrdom. As such, they were gathered with the martyrs of the advent of Islam. Iran's revolutionary leaders also sought to depict the Islamic Revolution as a continuation of the glorious struggles against tyranny waged by past prophets. One sermon from May 1984 noted, quote, "Moses revolted against the pharaohs, Abraham against Nimrod and the Nimrods, Jesus against the tyrants of his time, and Muhammad, too, delivered the people from the hands of oppressive rulers. In contrast to what some self-interested people say, that the prophets had always been instruments of oppressors, they always stood up against the taguts, tyrants and idolaters." End quote. Additionally, in 1980, Khamenei noted that, quote, "Our Islamic Revolution was therefore a resumption of the revolution of the prophets, because it stood up against injustice from its inception, against the oppressors who rules Iran." End quote. In this case, equating current uses of violence with the heroic acts of exemplary figures from the past essentially constitutes a motivational frame because it encourages participation rather than free riding by implying infinite rewards in the afterlife. Even beyond attracting new converts willing to commit violence, however, such appeals to a glorious tradition represent a group's effort to legitimate its use of violence in the eyes of the broader population, particularly if the tradition resonates with a host population. Narratives that attempt to draw a connection between current violence and the activities of past canonical figures, or that resonate with extant master narratives within a society, may represent efforts to increase or at least maintain a population's threshold of violence. Is there any empirical evidence that narratives and more generally discourse can be used in either of these manners to successfully raise a population's threshold of violence? Bernardi et al. Noted that shortly after a 2005 bovine inoculation campaign instituted by multinational forces in Iraq, a rumor spread that U.S. forces had begun an effort to starve the Iraqi population by poisoning its livestock. Although it is unclear whether the rumor was spread by Iraqi insurgents or arose organically, it proved potent at that time because not only was Iraq undergoing an existential and socio-political crisis, but also a large amount of its livestock was dying because of disease and a significant water shortage. The conspiratorial nature of the rumor found a receptive audience, given Iraqi frustration with political, social, and economic conditions in post-Hussein Iraq, and Iraqi suspicions that the United States invaded Iraq to pillage its oil resources. Bernardi et al., again in Narrative Landmines, noted that the rumor provided a convenient target for pent-up frustrations, anxieties, and fears, which led farmers to turn a blind eye to insurgent activities and even to participate in violence. Hence, the rumor potentially contributed to an increase in the threshold of violence among a group of people, and even if it was not initially spread by insurgents, it represents an example of how a narrative could be used by insurgents to gain greater acceptance of violent activities. The rumor alleging sinister American intentions circulated within an environment that featured master narratives related to the Crusades and European colonialism, and the fidelity between the rumor and these master narratives made it more potent, as the authors noted. Quote, "The bovine poisoning mosaic implicitly invoked the Crusader master narrative, in which non-Arab, non-Muslim invaders plunder Arab lands for their riches while proclaiming allegiance to a higher power and a more righteous religion. The wanton killing of livestock and the imposition of privation through drought in this mosaic parallel the slaughter of Muslims by Christian soldiers of the First Crusade. The accusation of economic exploitation parallels the 19th century reworking of the Crusader narrative in the form of colonization. This master narrative of invasion, destruction, and exploitation eventually defined the U.S. occupation across Iraq, and even more problematically, the Islamic world, undermining U.S. strategic messaging and, as a result, U.S. strategic planning and vision. More important, the association of the bovine rumor mosaic with this Crusader narrative enhanced its threat. Rumors that activate, catalyze, and extend this historical and widely understood narrative about foreign invaders are both more problematic because of their implications and more widespread because of their narrative fidelity. In other words, because they follow the same pattern and underlying message as the Crusader narrative, these rumors will find widespread traction and belief because they reinforce a prevailing narrative of invasion and exploitation." End quote. The authors called such rumors narrative improvised explosive devices, IEDs, because they help, quote, entice contested populations into a kind of complacency, even tolerance, for kinetic IEDs targeting U.S. and government forces, end quote. Hence, the strategic use of narratives and their association with relevant master narratives represents another potential tool violent resistance movements can use to increase a population's threshold of violence.